Imagine the soundscape of a turn-of-the-century fairground, a bustling dance hall, or a Parisian street cafe. The melody that filled these spaces wasn't always played by a band, but sometimes by a machine, the mechanical organ. In this short programme, we celebrate the life and enduring work of one of mechanical music's greatest figures, Eugène Louis Blache, in this, the year of the 150th anniversary of his birth. Born in Paris on October the 23rd, 1875, to French-Polish parents, Louis was initially expected to follow his father into the world of business and commerce. But Blache had a different calling. He chose to pursue music, forging a successful career in an industry that was rapidly evolving. Upon finishing his education around 1887, Blache was apprenticed to the renowned piano manufacturers Pleyel and Company. It was here that he encountered notable composers including Léo Delibes, who encouraged him to develop his musical talents. During this period, Blache formed his own salon orchestra, which toured Parisian restaurants, dance halls and private residences. Pleyel's close business ties led Blache to one of the world's largest mechanical instrument producers, Gavioli and Company. In the late 1890s, Blache transferred to Gavioli, rising quickly to a senior position in the music department. This was a pivotal time for the industry, which was shifting from the limitations of the barrel organ to the revolutionary perforated cardboard book. It was in arranging music for this new format that Blache truly made his name. Following the death of Anselmo Gavioli in 1902, Blache moved to a competing powerhouse at the centre of Parisian industry, Luminaire Frères. Here his talent flourished. Noted journalist and photographer Jacques Boyer praised Blache's work, stating that the musical arrangements were all the more pleasant when combined with the taste of the artist-composer. As arrangements on perforated cards were required to carry copyright stamps and to pay royalty fees, Luminaire secured favourable terms with in-house composer-arrangers such as Blache. This allowed the company to expand its substantial music catalogues without the burden of additional external fees. By the outbreak of war in 1914, their catalogue featured upwards of 30 original works by Blache. It is with Luminaire that we hear our first performances. We present them on the museum's 35-key instrument originally supplied to England in 1907. Though the organ was later modernised and travelled with a juvenile roundabout until 1986, it has been returned to its original specification for today's performance in order to render these pieces exactly as they would have been heard in 1907. Another popular model from this period was the Limonare 49-key scale. Our next pieces are performed on a provincial example of this style, manufactured by Dussault and Company in Lille, circa 1913. This instrument is a quintessential representation of the type of organ that would have accompanied juvenile rides and entertained the patrons of dance halls and cafes across the continent. The First World War halted all production at Limonare, and Blache was mobilised into the French armed forces. At the end of hostilities, the industry he knew was transformed, and his position was no longer available. Undeterred, and with a young family to support, Blache partnered briefly with an agent for the Frati Piano Orchestrion. After receiving offers from Belgium and the USA, Blache chose to move to London in 1919, joining the Chiappa family at their Little Bath Street factory. Chiappas had been the British agents for Gavioli and continued the maintenance of instruments and the supply of new music books on their own account following the liquidation of the former business. Blache's passion for composition travelled with him. Spurred on by the arrival of his second daughter in December 1919, he wrote a polka dedicated to their names. Though he had left Limonare, his compositions continued to be issued in their catalogues until the 1930s, now with the added benefit of collecting royalties. Our next two pieces feature music composed during this time. Throughout the 1920s, Blache, known simply as the Frenchman by Chiappa's clients, honed his established and distinctive arranging style. Whether it was marches, songs, or classical repertoire, everything he produced was a success. His work in London undoubtedly extended the longevity of the mechanical organ's life in Britain, even as the industry began to decline elsewhere in Europe. Our next performances come from one of the collection's 89-key gavioli instruments. Built at the turn of the 20th century, this instrument was imported and converted to the scale. It travelled extensively in a set of galloping horses before retiring to Butlins Amusement Park, from where it was acquired in a derelict condition. By the mid-1930s, the mechanical organ industry was in sharp decline. Low-cost, amplified records had gripped the travelling fair and dance hall markets. The organs simply couldn't keep up. Not the retiring sort, Blache left his full-time position at Chiappa's to take up an electrical technician's development post with a local machinery manufacturer. He continued to supply music arrangements to Chiappa's from home until his death on November 14, 1957. As a keen proponent of scientific discovery, he donated his body to the University College Hospital, London. Louis Blache dedicated his life to the pursuit of learning, discovery and progress. While approximately 50 of his original compositions survive today, his actual output was probably far higher. The music archives at Chiappa Limited ensure Blache's superb arrangements are preserved and remain available. Collectors across the globe continue to discover previously unknown compositions on antique luminaire books. We close our programme with two performances on this collection's 89-key merengue organ, representing the zenith of Blache's orchestral arranging talent. This instrument is one of only two known to survive featuring merengue's patent grellophone sleigh bell action, a truly spectacular finale for a truly spectacular musician.